I'm here to tell you this morning that Christianity is the greatest revolution in history. And I'll help you to understand what I mean by a revolution. This came from the dictionary. A revolution is a sudden, radical, or complete change. And if you look at the entire scheme of history, the changes brought about by Jesus Christ were indeed very sudden. His ministry was about 3 years, and yet he's changed the world forever. And the word radical comes from the same root word as the word radish, because a radish is a root. And the word radical also means going to the root. And I believe that what Jesus did goes to the root of every single person and of how we look at the world and of how the people around him would have looked at the world. So it was sudden and radical, and it ought to be a complete change. Hopefully we can be completely changed by what Jesus did. So I do believe that Christianity was a revolution. It was something radical, in that it went to the root of people's hearts, of how they looked at something like religion, of how they looked at the world and people around them, and it was sudden and complete. And this is a paradigm shift, meaning a whole different way of looking at things. When Jesus Christ came onto the scene, he gave people whole new ways to look at things, to think about things differently, as opposed to mere reform. Reform would be, well, let's just change a couple of details. Reform for Judaism would be, instead of sacrificing this animal, let's do a different animal instead, or do it at a different time of day or something like that. But he gave us an entire new perspective on everything. And I have mentioned here both Judaism and paganism, because these were the two main options that people would have had in Palestine when Jesus came on the scene. There was either Judaism, following the God of the Bible, who is now the Christian God, or you could be a pagan, which we might think of as a lawless person who did whatever they wanted, but really a pagan would have had various religious practices and believed in different gods as well. But Jesus completely changed the Jewish and the pagan world, and he made something new, which is Christianity. And I'd like to talk about how he did that and what that means this morning. He revolutionized Judaism by replacing an old idea with a new idea. The old idea was, I justify myself to God, and I rightfully earn his approval by rule keeping and righteous living. So it's something that I end up deserving, that God owes me because I've done things a certain way. And he replaced that with a new idea, which is that God the Father welcomes with open arms anyone who will submit to his authority. It's no longer about who deserves it or what they may have done in the past. It's now that God welcomes everyone. And we really like that idea, but that was offensive to a lot of the Jews in Jesus' time, as we will see. This was made clear by Scripture. They didn't like the fact that just anyone could go follow Jesus and learn from him. It upset them. I think the clearest place where you see that happening and where you see Jesus commenting on it is in the story of the prodigal son. And you may not have looked at it in that way, but I want to point that out for us. It's important, I believe it's very important, and this was pointed out to me not long ago, to look at the story of the prodigal son, which you may have heard many times, in its context in the Bible, which starts in Luke 15, verses 1 through 3. So this sets the scene for the parable of the prodigal son. It says, Now all the tax collectors and the sinners were coming near him to listen to him. Both the Pharisees and the scribes began to grumble, saying, This man receives sinners and eats with them. So he told them this parable, saying, and then he told them 3 parables. He told them the story about the lost sheep, about the lost coin, and then about the prodigal son. And what needs to be noticed is that these tax collectors and sinners were outcasts, and they weren't well liked by the religious people, the Pharisees and the scribes. And the Pharisees and scribes were upset about the fact that they were even around Jesus, that Jesus was even taking the time to talk to them. And it's in that context that Jesus says, Look, if a man loses a sheep and then he finds it, there's rejoicing. And he was implying, if a person is lost and they can be found, we should rejoice. And then with the lost coin, the same thing. But then when he gets to the story of the prodigal son, he really makes the situation personal, because he brings not only the tax collectors and sinners into the parable, but he brings the Pharisees and the scribes into the parable as well. And you'll notice that the younger brother in the story of the prodigal son represents these tax collectors and sinners and people that no one likes. And the older son in the story of the prodigal son is the scribes and the Pharisees. So it starts in Luke 15, 11 through 13. We start reading about the prodigal son. It says, a man had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the estate that falls to me. So he divided his wealth between them. And not many days later, the younger son gathered everything together and went on a journey into a distant country, and there he squandered his estate with loose living. And we may not be familiar with the ancient customs of fathers leaving an inheritance to their sons, but much like is normally the case with us, it's when the father dies that the son receives the inheritance. And for the son to ask to get his inheritance now is basically to say that he's tired of waiting for his father to die. And he's putting a severance in their relationship by doing that, and that would have been understood by the original readers. It's someone who has turned his back on his father, just as someone could turn their back on God. And then after that, he goes and he squanders it, and he lives in a foolish way. And then he comes to his senses, and we pick up, Luke 15, 20 through 24. He says, So he got up and came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion for him, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his slaves, Quickly bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet, and bring the fattened calf, kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found. And they began to celebrate. Something else I'm told historically is that it was undignified for the patriarch of a family to run in public. And so the fact that this father went running out and threw his arms around his son and kissed him would have been just a total disregard for what anyone else thought about him, just out of his love for his son, that he was willing to do that. And he starts a celebration. And if you think about that in this context of the scribes and the Pharisees coming to Jesus and him welcoming them, it's as if Jesus is saying we ought to celebrate anyone who wants to come and to learn about God and who wants to learn to be righteous. And now you'll see how the older son would represent the Pharisees and the scribes. It says, Now his older son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. And he summoned one of the servants and began inquiring what these things could be. And he said to him, Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf, because he has received him back safe and sound. But he became angry and was not willing to go in. So the interesting thing is that while before the younger son was the one who was separated from his father, now the older son is the one who is separated from his father, to imply that the scribes and the Pharisees are potentially separating themselves from God by the attitude that they're taking, which would have totally turned everything upside down for how the scribes and the Pharisees wanted to look at things, which is what a revolution does. It changes everything in ways that people don't like. And just as they were angry, and it literally says that the older son was not willing to go in. He wasn't willing to go along with what the father wanted anymore, and thus he was separated from his father. And you'll see in 28 through 32, And his father came out and began pleading with him. This is what Jesus, through the parable, is doing for the scribes and Pharisees. The father came out and began pleading with him. But he answered and said to his father, Look, for so many years I have been serving you, and I have never neglected a command of yours. And yet you have never given me a young goat, so that I may celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your wealth with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him." And he said to him, "Son, you have always been with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, for this brother of yours was dead and has begun to live, and was lost and has been found." And what you might notice is that the older brother, in this case, in addition to being upset that someone else who hasn't been living the right way can come and be accepted by the Father, he also seems to think that he deserves something from the Father because he's earned it. And that was the mindset of the Jews that Jesus seemed to be changing and replacing in this parable and in all of his teachings and in the way he lived and taught. You see that the older son said, "I have never neglected a command of yours," as if to say, now you are in my debt. Now, because I've done what I'm supposed to do, you have to do the nice thing for me. And so I hope that sort of demonstrates how the story of the prodigal son was revolutionary to the religious people who were hearing it, because it told them that anyone who is willing to submit to the Father can come to him, and that is not because we earn it or because we deserve it. It's simply because we are willing to submit to him and to come and to follow his will, which was something that these religious people, these Jews for the most part, most of them, did not appreciate. Thus, Jesus revolutionized the ideas of Judaism by replacing the old idea, "I justify myself to God," and rightfully earn his approval by rule-keeping and righteous living, with the new idea, God the Father welcomes with open arms anyone who will submit to his authority. There is no person who does not belong here if they will only come and submit themselves to God's will. If anyone is willing to trust and obey God, then they belong in his family. The second idea here is revolutionizing paganism, which is perhaps a little less difficult to understand. The old idea of the pagans was that the gods were proud, great-souled, harsh, and chaotic, and we imitate them in our worship. Pagans understood the whole world to be this structure of power, like a pyramid, and whoever has the most power is at the top and gets what they want. And even the gods, were subject to one another, and they were petty, and they fought with one another. And the idea of being great-souled in the ancient world was basically thinking very highly of yourself. And this was imitated in their worship. And indeed, they believed the gods were chaotic. In their worship, they would have these ecstatic experiences of just writhing on the ground or being controlled by other spirits, or they would eat raw meat, or they would drink excessive amounts of alcohol as part of their worship. And the new idea, what Jesus had to say to the pagans, was that the gods were not like they had pictured, that there was one God and that he was meek, merciful, compassionate, and self-sacrificing, and that we imitate him in our worship and our lives, that he wasn't this God who was vindictive, who would try to get whatever he wanted at the expense of others because of the power that he had, but rather he wanted to do what was necessary to help other people, that he was loving in an unconditional way, which was also offensive to the pagan idea of the world and has been offensive to people since. There have been philosophers who are very upset with Christ and with Christianity for exalting these ideas of being meek and merciful and compassionate and taking care of the least of these and looking out for the little guy and being humble. They don't like that. They believe that the best way for us to go forward is to be proud people who are ambitious, who each strive for his own fulfillment. And I believe in Jesus standing before Roman officials who would have been pagans, you see how he revolutionized paganism. So let's look at Jesus before Herod. Now Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus, for he had wanted to see him for a long time, because he had been hearing about him and was hoping to see some sign performed by him. And he questioned him at some length, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there, accusing him vehemently. And Herod, with his soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. So here Jesus is standing in trial before Herod. And the only reason, I believe, we see this picture the way we do is because we know about what happened after Jesus was crucified. We know that he was the Son of God and that he was raised on the third day, that he is the creator of the universe. But if you didn't know that, and you were just some random Roman citizen who was reading about this, you would see things completely differently. See Jesus as just this weird, crazy guy who has this important, powerful man, Herod, who has authority over him. But everything is changed in light of the resurrection. And that is at the heart of how Jesus revolutionized everything, was in his death, burial, and resurrection. So that these men had contempt for him, they were mocking him, they were so sure that they were better men than he was, that they had a higher position than he was. They probably could not have imagined that a man who wouldn't even open his mouth in his own defense, a man who was so meek, who was so concerned for the poor and for the least of these, was actually a better man and a more powerful man than they were. And so Jesus goes before Pilate. Of Pilate, it is said, he entered the praetorium again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You do not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you, and I have authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above." And little did Pilate know either that Jesus was from above, from that authority that had been given to Pilate, as God had given authority to the governments of the world. And so once again, everything is turned upside down for us. We see Jesus as the king and not Pilate, because we know the end of the story, and because we've come to appreciate a king who was self-sacrificing, who was concerned for people who were lesser than him, in a way that Pilate was not, as Pilate thought that he was the one who had the authority. Now, Pilate didn't know what Colossians 1:15 through 17 says. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, for by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, which would include Herod and Pilate. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. The revolutionary idea that shattered paganism was the idea that a man like Jesus, who walked around full of compassion, full of self-sacrifice, full of concern for people lesser than him, could be this God of the universe, that was God's attitude, and that we worship him by being like him, instead of being personally ambitious, being servants of others. In Mark 10:42 through 45, Jesus tried to teach this to his disciples. He says, calling them to himself, Jesus said to them, "You know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But it is not this way among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." The idea that God would come to earth not to be served, but to serve, and that then he would tell us to do the same, that the one of us who wants to be first should make ourselves last, was a revolutionary idea. Jesus turns everything upside down. Look at Philippians 2:5 through 11, and how we are encouraged to imitate him in that. "Have this attitude in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant, and being made in the likeness of men. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. For this reason also God highly exalted him, and bestowed on him the name which is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee will bow, of those who are in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and that every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. How difficult it must have been for so many pagans who had valued ambition and great-souledness and thinking well of yourself above all else, to bow their knee to this Jesus who was so humble. So he revolutionized paganism as well. The old idea is that the gods are proud, they are great-souled, they are harsh and chaotic, and we imitate them in our worship. The new idea is that God is meek, merciful, gentle, compassionate, self-sacrificing, and we imitate him in our worship and in our lives. So Jesus Christ revolutionized everything. I just want to give you 3 points here that we can take away to apply to our lives. We may not be Jews and we may not be pagans, but those two classes of people, those two groups of people, teach us about human nature and about things we might see in us as well. So the first point is that because he made the most important thing not how good I am, but how good God is, I worship, serve, and obey him out of love rather than obligation. So that Jewish way of saying I have to check off all the boxes so that I can put God in my debt and so I'll deserve salvation is thrown out. And we don't come to church because we have to, and we don't worship him because we have to, but because we would love to, because we love him. That's something to grow into if we haven't reached that point yet. That's what Christianity brings to the table. That's what it represents. Secondly, because he is a God of sacrificial love, I too must love unconditionally and self-sacrificially. What a different world it would be if everyone learned to love unconditionally and sacrificially. It is difficult. It takes practice, but luckily we have lots of opportunities to practice loving people when they do not meet our conditions, and loving people when they are frustrating to us, when they have faults, as they certainly will. And lastly, because he came not to be served but to serve, I too must be a servant. And I would encourage you to see yourself as a servant of God's church and a servant of all the people in this world who you can help. I'm glad that we want to bring more into focus the idea of being a servant in our community. And we mentioned some ideas about Habitat for Humanity, or about raking leaves, or about some other idea that you might have that we'll be looking forward to doing in the future. So I encourage you, whatever one of these you need to hear the most, or maybe all of them you really need to hear, to apply this to yourself. To serve God out of a true devotion, rather than spitefully or rather than to get control over him. To love those in your life unconditionally and to be a servant of all that you know. One final thing that I want to add comes from Romans chapter 6, 1 through 7. If a revolution is a sudden and radical and complete change, we each want to have this revolution take place in our own lives. I believe, according to many passages, such as this in Romans 6, that happens at baptism. We read here, "Do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ Jesus have been baptized into his death? Therefore, we have been buried with him through baptism into death, so that, as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life." Paul seems to be clearly explaining what happens in baptism. He says we're buried with him through baptism so that we can walk in newness of life. This is how we get the newness of life. For if we have become united with him in the likeness of his death, certainly we shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection. Knowing this, that our old self was crucified with him in order that our body of sin might be done away with, so that we would no longer be slaves of sin. For he who has died is freed from sin. If we will be united with him in the likeness of his death, we will also be in the likeness of his resurrection. A resurrection and a new life is a revolution that takes place in our lives that gives us new ways of looking at everything that ought to change us in a deep way. And in closing, I'd just like to encourage us all and encourage myself to let that revolution be as drastic as it ought to be. Not to take our cues from society around us to decide what is normal, not to use society as our standard and try to be, just a little bit better than the world, but to look at Christ and to serve to follow him and to be like him. So if you'd like to be baptized into Christ for the remission of sins, to experience what is described in Romans chapter 6, verses 1 through 7, or if we can help you in any way, please come as we stand and sing together this morning.